This is Jen, and this is my channel, The Liberty Lion. If you haven't already subscribed, go ahead and hit that button and do that now. Today we're going to talk about deception and how the government deceives people. Okay, now whether or not you are deceived is another question. Whether or not they're trying to deceive you is what I'm talking about today. So when you hear people say in the libertarian communities that everything you know is wrong, I'm going to try to explain some of that to you. I can't cover everything, otherwise this video would take 3 days to make. So does the government mean to deceive you? I propose that it does, and it does because it chooses to use vague words that have a greater meaning than the way they explain it. So, for example, we have state in all capital letters, state starting with a lowercase s, and state with an uppercase s. All of three of these could mean something completely different, and some of them could kind of mean the same thing. But how do we know which is which? Almost every single definition of the word state in the federal codes says that it's a state of the United States. So when you look at a state of the United States, you ask yourself, what is a state? Because the individual states, the sovereign states, created the federal government. And the federal government is called the United States. And the United States is an instrumentality of the states for defense purposes. So if I were to create a corporation, I would be sovereign to my corporation. My corporation would be a dependent state. It depends on me to move it. It cannot move by itself. Therefore, it has no sovereignty. I'm the independent state of my corporation. I am the sovereign to my corporation because an independent state has sovereignty and a dependent state has none. The federal government is a dependent state, has no sovereignty to the states. The states did give it some sovereignty for some certain purposes, but the states are supposed to control the federal government. So when the federal government says a state of the United States, what is it talking about? It could be talking about a subject matter as a subject matter or a matter of subject. So the Constitution gave the federal government some jurisdiction, which is power and authority, over some certain things, such as defense. So if you read the preamble, you see that we, the people of the United States, do some things for the United States of America. So we, the people of the instrumentality, or the instrument, or the tool, do some things for the states, the independent states. Or we, the dependent state, do some things for the independent state. Or we, the dependent state, work for the independent states for defense with a C purposes. Defense with a C means fortification. So the United States is a instrumentality or a dependent state to the states. So what does it mean when it says a state of a dependent state? A state of an instrumentality. So something that the instrumentality controls. They call it a state, but it's not the independent states because the federal government cannot control independent states because it's dependent to the states. It's dependent to the independent states. Okay, so if you don't understand this, it's because you weren't meant to. That was the whole point. Now in the Constitution, when you read that the states created the federal government, it's talking about the independent states. And in my opinion, when it says the states shall not, the federal government is talking about when the states become dependent states, or the states that the federal government controls, which are its subject matters, or its federal lands, its military reservations. So during war, it would make sense that the independent states would become dependent to the federal government. But as soon as that war is over, the states, the independent states, would become independent again, and the federal government would become dependent. And like I said, if you don't understand that, that's okay, because you weren't meant to. So during the Civil War, when some states started to secede from the Union, Lincoln called them rebel states. And what he did was he took over their legislators, their state governments, put in his military people, called them illegal states, and took them over. And then someone else asked, well, if it's an illegal state, why are you taking it over? What is it about the federal government taking over an illegal state that makes it legal? Because it was a coup, it was a scam. A state created for legal purposes, which is a dependent state and has no sovereignty. Lincoln took over the rebel states and their governments and installed his military officers and made the states that were free, sovereign, and independent, or independent states, and made them dependent states, which removed their sovereignty. So when Lincoln took over the states and instituted his fiction, which Chief Justice John Marshall called corporations fictions, which they are, and they're also called persons. He said there were fictions, and so these legal states are simply fictions. They're businesses or corporations that were taken over by the federal government. So the federal government that was dependent or an instrumentality of the states then took over the states. Now there's an old maxim that says that which you create, you control, and whoever is the master cannot be turned into the servant, and whoever is the servant cannot be made the master. So the independent states were the masters to the federal government. They were supposed to control the federal government. And the federal government during the Civil War took over the states. And people believe that this was for slavery, and so they accept it. But it was not. It was for business. It was because Lincoln wanted to allow the corporations to take over. Think railroads, Rockefeller, and Gates, okay, back in those days. Because Gates and Rockefeller are related through Nelson Rockefeller. Okay, the word territory. Territory is a word that has a lot of meanings. Are you talking about territory of the United States or territory of the states? Also, you could say district. When they use district, what do they mean? It's all meant to confuse, because these are very broad words that have a variety of meanings depending on where you stand. If you're standing in a state, the territory is a state, but are you standing in a dependent state or a dependent state? If you're standing in the independent state, or what was originally the independent state, your territory is the whole state. If you're standing in the dependent state or the federal state, your territory is only the federal lands. Government and government. Capital G government and lowercase government. What do they mean? Well, let's see. (31) USC Code Section 1537. It talks about services between the United States capital G government. So that's services. So a service provider, a business, capital G government business, and the District of Columbia, lowercase g government. So if lowercase g government is a state created by the people lawfully of that state, or a government created by the people lawfully of that state, it's talking about lowercase g government, which would go with lowercase s state. But when you make something into an instrumentality or a business, you're talking about a capital S state, which is a service, and a capital G government. You can look that up. It's 31 U.S. Code Section 1537. This was just sent to me the other day. The United States capital G government may provide services to the lowercase g District of Columbia government. So a capital G government of the United States, or an instrumentality of the United States, may provide services to the people of the lowercase g government and the people of that state. So lowercase g government would be a lawful government. Uppercase G government would be an instrumentality or a service provider. Defense and defense. Sounds the same. Two completely different words, completely different meanings. I've gone over this in some of my other videos. Defense with a C is Old French for fortification, written all about in the Laws of Nation. The early dictionaries, the early English dictionaries do not include the word defense with an S until they add certain suffixes onto the back, and then it changes from a C to an S to abide by spelling rules. But there is no definition just for defense with an S in the old dictionaries. You can find it now because it's commonly used. Defense with an S is a Latin word for vengeance. So when they changed it, was it because they wanted to seek vengeance upon the American people by use of their instrumentalities to change our lowercase g government to an uppercase G government, make it into a corporation, and our lowercase s states into an uppercase S state? How about people? This is specific people. We, the specific people of the United States, of the instrumentality, not lowercase p people. If the Constitution wanted it to include all people everywhere throughout America, they would have used a lowercase p to go with their lowercase g and their lowercase s. But that's not what they did. They used an uppercase p because it's an instrumentality that works for an uppercase G to create an uppercase S. How about of? The United States of America, the United States within America in a geographical sense. Of means within. Citizen of the United States. Citizen within the instrumentality, the federal lands. Within meaning on the federal lands. The old laws required a citizen of a state, when he wanted to work for the federal government, he had to move on to the federal lands, which were the annexed lands, apply for citizenship, get accepted through the state legislators, the lowercase s state legislators, for the lowercase g government. One of the lowercase p people to apply to become a citizen of the United States or within the United States on the federal lands to become a uppercase G government for an uppercase S state to become an uppercase P people, which is one of we the people. Okay? If you're confused, don't worry, you're supposed to be. That's the way they did it. Back in the old days, they knew that people, the average person, was not well educated. They didn't have very many schools back then. The settlers were so busy trying to tame the land, settle the land, to tame it, to domesticate it, They didn't have time to worry about uppercase and lowercase, this, that, and whatever. Even today, we work, 40 hours a week to 80 hours a week if you're starting a business. And who has time to worry about that kind of stuff? Person, in a legal sense, has a variety of meanings. A capital P person, in a legal sense, means a fiction or an artificial being or entity, meaning a corporation, being one of the capital P people working for a capital G government and in a capital S state, being a legal state. But a natural person, perhaps this should be a lowercase p, is without legal entity or corporation, not under statutory law, not part of the federal government, being a lowercase p person, and a lowercase g government, and a lowercase s state, a citizen, but not of the United States, because the United States are for capital P people, capital G government, capital S state, an instrumentality. Okay, so a natural person without a legal entity is not under the control of the federal government. The federal government being full of capital P people, a service provider, capital G government, capital S state, subject matters. Okay. Person, a corporate entity within a legal system under a statutory law. So a person is a corporation. A corporation is ran by natural people, natural persons, okay, human beings. So you'll see in some of the laws that the capital P person, the capital P person is real but not true and consists of individuals or natural persons. But that doesn't mean that all natural persons are within the federal government or part of the federal government or controlled by the federal government. Because natural persons are not required to be part of the federal government. It's only when they create a person or a corporate entity to supply, specifically to supply services to the people, the citizens of the United States who are on the federal lands. So the citizen of the state applies for citizenship of the United States, the instrumentality, to become one of capital P people. Okay? And when they do that, they still maintain their status as a natural person, but they become a part of the corporate fiction. Okay? Because remember, Chief Justice John Marshall said that corporations are fictions. So let's go back to government, where I talked about 31 USC section 1537, services between the United States government and the District of Columbia. Okay, this government is a service provider. Capital G government, it's a corporation. This is proper capitalization for something specific. This is general, a general lawful government. So natural persons make up the legal persons, but then once you're a legal person, you leave the lowercase g government and become a member of the uppercase G government as a citizen within the United States or on the federal lands. You are still a natural person, But when you're on the federal lands, you leave it behind and you become a person, a legal entity. And then you're governed. Now, these legal entities, these corporations, were intended only to help supply services to the people on the federal lands, the people who left the state and became members of the federal land. Now, why did they do this? Because originally these people on the federal lands who became federal citizens did not have the services that they needed. They didn't have schools, insane asylums, hospitals, fire departments, police departments. So they needed to come off the federal lands just for some things. And so the federal government became a service provider to the state, to the lowercase s state, to create uppercase s states. Subject matters, which were the contracts between the federal government and the state to allow these people on the United States to become 14th Amendment citizens or 14th Amendment citizens of the federal government and of the state. So for these people to come off the federal lands, they had to pass the 14th Amendment, allowing it. For them to become also members of the state, the uppercase S state subject matter. So that they could pay, the federal government could pay the states for any services the citizens within the United States, or the instrumentality, the federal instrumentality for defense with the sea purposes, so that they could go to the hospitals, asylums, and send their kids to school and such. Okay? Small business with the federal government. A small business is also a small jurisdiction. So the federal government, which is an instrumentality, needed to create businesses so that its federal citizens could send their kids to schools, the hospitals, all these services that they didn't have on the federal lands. These small businesses are also called small jurisdictions. So it's like a jurisdiction within a jurisdiction. So you have the lowercase state owning the schools and hospitals and asylums. The federal government wants to send its federal citizens to that state. So this state allowed for the federal government to create an uppercase S state within it for those federal people. Now, the federal government can dictate laws to its federal people on its federal lands. So the vaccination laws that the federal government is talking about is supposed to be for those federal people on the federal lands going to the state schools, for example, children. So those people have to abide by the federal laws, the federal dictates. But even then, it's not mandatory. They've said themselves it's not mandatory because there's a big difference between can and will. And they do practice deceit because they say you will, even though they don't have the authority to use force. And that's part of the deceit. Because nobody can make anyone do such a thing as what they're making kids do to go to school. So these small jurisdictions, such as school districts, okay, these small businesses are small jurisdictions, and small jurisdictions are school districts, for example, federal water districts, federal hospitals, federal veterans hospitals. These are small jurisdictions, so they're little tiny jurisdictions inside the state lands to help supply services to the federal people in the lowercase s state so that they can receive services from the uppercase s state, which is the instrumentality. Okay? Instrumentalities, instruments, tools, corporations, etc., of the federal government to supply services to the people on the federal lands. If you don't understand that, that's fine. You're not intended to understand it because they wanted it to be vague. I've seen them take old laws that were pretty clear, mark out the specific terms, and replace it with a vague term, saying, and they show it in the law. They say, this phrase, in quotes, is now replaced by this phrase, in quotes. And the phrase in the original quote that's being replaced was more specific. And then later it was made more vague so that you can't understand it. This is how they expand power. This is how they expand their jurisdiction. This is how they make you think it's bigger than it is, which is a deceitful practice that I've talked about in the Army Manual, published in 2019 and released to the public. Deceptive practices to make yourself seem bigger than you are, to scare your enemy. So the people are the enemy, I guess you could say, of the federal government. They want to take us over. They have been trying to take us over for a long time. They use their instrumentalities to do it. For example, the Federal Reserve Bank. It has no authority. The IRS, it has no authority. CDC, FDA, ICE, they have no authority over people who are not on or within the federal lands, the instrumentality, the small jurisdictions. You're a citizen, but you're not one of the United States unless you're a federal citizen on federal lands doing federal work and receiving Federal Reserve notes because you took an oath to become a part of the corporation. The corporation is the instrumentality of the United States of America. Go read the preamble of the Constitution. To become a capital case P, people, you have to take an oath and become a citizen within the federal lands or the instrumentality. That makes you a part of the corporation. Those instrumentalities have no more authority than the federal government can give it. If the federal government doesn't have the authority to do it, it can't create an instrumentality and then give that instrumentality more authority than the federal government has itself. But they tell these instrumentalities, you can do and say whatever you want. You can lie. So they lie and they say the federal government or Congress gives us authority to. Okay, you may have the authority to do a thing, but I don't have to accept it. I don't have to be a part of it. I can deny it. The Congress doesn't have the power to force you to become a capital P people under a capital G government and part of a capital S state. That's what it wants. It wants to force you into it because it gives it more power. These corporations of the federal government, therefore, have no more power than the federal Congress has. And the federal Congress, who's made up of capital P people who have an oath and are citizens within the federal lands, on the federal lands, of the federal lands, part of the instrumentality, have no right to tell anybody off federal lands anything. They have no right to come off federal lands unless they have specifically for them, those people, those capital P people, a reason to go to a hospital, asylum, send their kids to school, But they don't have a right to force us to use their Federal Reserve notes or to tax us or anything, because all the laws they make are only for the federal citizens on the federal lands, or control of their instrumentalities that they create to aid the citizens on the federal lands with services inside the lowercase s state, which is what Mr. Cowan calls in 1867 a lawful state created by the people. So you have an uppercase S state created by the federal government, which is a service provider or an instrumentality to its federal citizens inside the lowercase s state on the federal lands. Okay, so these are just some of the ways that the federal government deceives us. And perhaps it was done intentionally, perhaps it's not originally done intentionally, but over the years it has become very intentional. And it's just one way that they use against people to make themselves seem bigger than they are, so that they can pretend to have power and authority over people that it has no power or authority over. And subject matters, such as laws, that it has no power over, that it pretends to have power over. It's created businesses or corporations, or what it calls instrumentalities or small jurisdictions, and they write those very vaguely to make people believe that it has certain power over them, over a certain subject. So taxes, federal taxes. If you're not a part of the federal government, you don't owe a federal tax. You're not required to use Federal Reserve notes. You can use gold and silver all you want. You can use it all day. I don't care if it's in the Constitution, because the Constitution is the instrumentality of the states for defense purposes. And so the people who worked for the federal government were supposed to receive, for compensation for their services, gold and silver. And that gold and silver was supposed to be used or given to them by the states, because the states were supposed to pay its officers and employees on the federal lands to the federal government, and then the federal government issued it back to the people of the states, of the federal states. And if that's confusing, well, like I say, it's supposed to be. You're not supposed to understand. So if I've confused you even more than you thought you were before, that was the intention. That's what the federal government has been doing. And then it takes over the schools and makes sure that it doesn't teach you what you need to know, so that you can understand the difference between state, state and state, government and government, defense and defense, people and people, citizen of the United States, natural person, corporate person, small business, small jurisdiction, etc., etc. So like, share, and subscribe. Tell your friends about my channel. I'd really appreciate it. I've been kicked off almost all social media, as you can imagine would be the case based on what I teach. And be kind to one another, and I'll see you in the next video.